today, in this beginning part of our series for Home Roasting 101, we're going to be taking a look at finding the right home coffee roaster for you. And that starts with really 5 main points: budget, capacity, control, a chaff collector, and its ability to profile, to be able to follow a profile, and also maybe even an auto feature. So let's get started. All right, thanks for joining me here today at the Virtual Coffee Lab. I'm so glad that you joined me. This channel is devoted towards home coffee roasting. I've done over 120 videos, and they entail everything from basics of operating a roaster to the roasting profile. So there is a playlist and there is a video in my collection, in my library, that will definitely help you, and I would encourage you to search around and take a look. A few of my favorite playlists are The Secret Sauce of Roasting Coffee at Home. That one really is an eye-opener when it comes to understanding what we're doing with the coffee and ultimately what we have to do with the coffee to roast great coffee. And I use a variety of different types of roasters. And another playlist that's really helpful is the Essentials playlist. This is a little more advanced and it involves some coffee concepts and theories. But hopefully in this video, we're going to get into some of that as we progress. But today I want to start specifically with home coffee roasting devices and ultimately some of the most common ones that you're going to run across as you start to look around and ask questions and do your research and begin to shop for a home coffee roasting machine. Now, I just want to be perfectly clear. I'm not promoting any of these to earn any money. These are roasters that I own. These are roasters that I've used, but they're not every roaster on the market. So there may be some that I don't talk about. That doesn't mean they're not good and that they're not a viable option. First, you're going to see we have the hot air popcorn popper. This is going to have a budget of around $30. It's probably one of your least expensive entry devices to roast coffee at home. It has a capacity of about 40 grams. It doesn't really have any control at all. There's just an on-off switch for the power, and it is going to roast the coffee using hot air. So hot air is going to move the beans around and it's going to roast the coffee, but it's just going to roast it at one fixed heat and one fixed fan level, and the results are going to vary. There is no chaff collector, you have no control, and ultimately this really is not a coffee roaster that you're going to be able to do profiling with. You're not going to really be able to alter the roast in a way to craft different types of coffee roasting profiles. Next is the popper from Sweet Maria's. This is a larger, more glorified version of a hot air popcorn popper, and that's not a criticism. That's just inherent in its design. It looks very similar to a hot air popcorn popper, but a bigger version. But there's some added features to this roaster. First, the budget. It's a great budget roaster to start with at $90. This roaster will roast up to 80 grams of coffee at a time, so twice the capacity of your typical hot air popcorn popper. You use air and heat to roast the coffee, but you have control with air and heat. You can control the fan and you can control the amount of heat to apply to the beans. And so yes, you can run a profile. You can have different profiles with this roaster. It's totally capable of doing that. And there is a built-in chaff collector. Now, we haven't talked about chaff yet, but ultimately as we roast coffee, there's a real thin skin. It's called the silver skin or called chaff that eventually will fall off the seed as we're roasting it. And depending upon your roaster and its design, you may have a way to catch that chaff in a place where it will spare you from a large mess, or like the popcorn popper, it'll just blow everywhere. So you're probably going to want to have a vacuum or something nearby to clean up. And you're going to really clean up after most of these roasters while we're roasting at home. One thing that I am not really going to be discussing, and that's ventilation. As always, you want to have great ventilation to be able to suck out any sort of smell, odor, or even smoke. The darker you go, the more smoke you're going to have. So the next roaster we're going to take a look at is the Fresh Roast SR540. I love this roaster. It's a great little roaster, and it has a capacity of 120 grams. So you can notice that we are increasing in our capacity, the amount of coffee that we can roast at one time. And this is a really important point because you should think about how much coffee you're going to consume. You can do the conversion for grams, but think about how many grams of coffee you're going to consume per week, and then add probably another 15% to that weight. And then that's going to be your total weight of coffee that you're going to be buying, green coffee. And we're going to talk in a next video about green coffee, the types of coffee you should start with, and how these might roast differently, and just some other tips about green coffee for beginners. So you're going to start out with kind of a weekly amount, and if you're using a small capacity roaster like a 40-gram popcorn popper, then you're probably going to have to roast multiple times in order to have enough coffee to roast for the week. And that's okay. That's just something that you should be aware of when you're considering the type of roaster that you want to buy. The Fresh Roast costs about $290, and it's often found and sold in bundles. So you'll be able to buy the roaster along with some coffee, some sample coffees for you to try and use. And that's kind of a cool thing. So you'll want to do some shopping and see what the best value is if you're interested in the SR540. There is a bigger sister of that roaster called the SR800. It can roast even more coffee. And these roasters are wonderful roasters because you can control both the fan and the heat. It's more powerful than the popper. It's more powerful than a hot air roaster. So you're going to have better bean movement, and you're going to have the ability to adjust the amount of power and the amount of air to help you craft a really great profile to roast coffee. I've got quite a few videos of me roasting with the SR540, and I've had some great experiences with that roaster. It does collect the chaff, so you won't have to worry about the mess, but ultimately, depending upon how you're going to cool the coffee, there is going to be some chaff mess, and it's just part of the hobby, but the collector will collect most of the chaff. Also, you'll be able to create a profile, but there are no automated features. All right, and next we have the Roma Pro. This is a newer roaster in the market. It is an air roaster, and as a matter of fact, all of the roasters that I've shared so far are air roasting devices. We're going to talk about some other coffee roasting machines that aren't air roasting devices here in just a minute, but this group deals with using hot air to roast coffee. The Roma Pro is unique because it is a large capacity air roaster. 300 gram maximum capacity. This roaster is available for $448, and I'll have links for all of these roasters so you can check them out and make the decision to take a closer look at any one of these you might be interested in. So for $448, you get a 300 gram capacity air roaster, and you are definitely able to profile roast with this coffee. You can craft some great coffee roasting manually, and there's also an automatic mode where you can roast a light, a medium, or in a dark roast, and the Roma Pro has some preset profiles to roast that coffee. I have a video on the Roma Pro that you can check out, and you'll see me demonstrate what I'm talking about. The other unique features about this roaster are that it has its own bean chute to cool the beans, and it has a cooling mode to cool the beans as well inside the roaster. And yes, it does have a chaff collector as well. By the way, this roaster can do profile roasting, and it has the auto function, as I mentioned. All of these roasters are going to allow you to roast manually, but there will be a couple that do have some auto features, and as I mentioned, the Roma Pro is one of those roasters. Okay, now before we get into the drum roasters, we've got a couple hand roasters that I want to talk to you about because these are a low entry point into the hobby, and this will give you hands-on experience smelling, seeing, and hearing the coffee as you're roasting it. It is a manual method, so it can be tiring to roast the coffee because you're going to be moving the beans around. And all of these roasters, the ones that I'm sharing with you, other than these two hand roasters, in their design, they are designed to move the beans around so that you have good color consistency, you get an even roast. It's just part of the way that the roaster operates. So whether it's hot air that's moving the beans around or a drum, the bean movement is something that the roaster does for you. Hand roasters, you have to move the hand roasting device around manually and keeping those beans moving so they don't burn. The Hive roaster is definitely one that should be on your radar if you're interested in hand roasting. It is a wonderful design. I've roasted probably some of the best coffee I've ever roasted on the Hive, but it is a manual roaster. So consistency is difficult, roast after roast, getting the same profile. There is a learning curve. It takes a little bit of understanding of how to manage the heat. And one of the biggest disadvantages with both of these hand roasters is you don't have the visibility of the beans that you might have with, say, the fresh roast or the Roma Pro, which is a glass tube, and you're seeing the color change, which is really important. You're able to smell really well, hear, and listen for crack. You know, those are things that are important. The Hive allows you to listen and also smell, but seeing into the Hive itself is difficult. There's a small opening. You're going to need an LED light to be able to peek into. It is really price point at under $100 for the base model. They run out quick. People, when they come in stock, people buy them up. So you need to keep checking on the website and finding out when the next available stock will be there. This roaster has a total capacity of 170 grams. You won't have a chaff collector. The way that the dome is designed, it does incinerate most of the chaff, so the chaff is not going to float all over the place. There'll be a little escape from the roaster while you're roasting it. You will need a vacuum for cleanup. You can definitely roast to profiles, and I have a whole series or a whole playlist on the Hive roaster. You can check out and watch me roasting different profiles with that roaster. The Nuvo, this is a ceramic roaster, and it is a very small capacity. It holds 40 grams of coffee, and it's basically as much as the hot air popcorn popper. It is a roaster that you need to wear a glove because your hand will get hot. It really isn't a great device to start with, but it's inexpensive enough where if you want to go for it and you want the experience and you want to see what happens to the beans, the Nuvo is an option for you to consider. All right, before we get into the drum roasters, I want to thank you for watching my videos. If this is the type of video that you like to see, hit the like button right now. Also subscribe to my channel because this is going to be a series for beginners. And even those who have been roasting for a while, there may be some interesting tips or some things that you can learn. And just watching the videos helps me and it supports this channel. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for subscribing. And let's get going into the drum roasting. The Behmor has been around a very long time. There have been a few variations or models, improvements to the roaster over time. And my model is back from like 2012 or something like that. And there is a newer version since then. So this is the Behmor 1600 Plus that I've been using. It actually started out as just a Behmor, and then I did the upgrade on it. And this has been a wonderful roaster for me to learn how to roast coffee. It's not a fast roaster. It's not anything like an air roaster. It roasts with a drum, and it uses a quartz heating element, kind of like a floor heater, to be able to generate heat to roast the beans. And a lot of professionals have started out their roasting career using the Behmor. I've got a whole playlist for roasting on the Behmor. It's a really cool roaster. I love it. I enjoy it. And it runs about $480. And this is a 1-pound drum roaster. Now, I'm going to say something about capacity here because I've been stating the capacity that the manufacturers have made claims to. This is what they say. So Behmor says you can roast a pound of coffee in this roaster, and you can, but it's just going to take you longer than you probably will want. So my recommendation is be realistic and just assume that you're going to roast a half a pound of coffee, max capacity for this roaster. Can you roast more? Sure you can. The cage inside the drum will hold more, but it's just going to take a long time. It could take you 15 or 20 minutes to roast a pound of coffee, when really you should be closer to the 10 to 14 minute range, or less if possible, depending upon how much coffee you're roasting. And again, we're talking about capacity because you need to think about how much coffee you're consuming in a week and how many times you're going to need to roast each week in order to meet your consumption. If you're sharing coffee with your family or your friends, I mean, you may be doing multiple roasts. I know that I was doing easily 2 roasts a week on the Behmor for many years, and then I upgraded. I went to a larger capacity roaster. So capacity is a thing that you should be thinking about. All right, so we talked about the capacity on the Behmor. It does use, like I mentioned, a quartz heating element. It is a light that has, it radiates. So the wavelength of the light does penetrate the bean, and it does roast into the bean. So it is very effective at roasting coffee. And I would encourage you to do research and learn about that. There are a lot of roasting devices that are using infrared type heat, or heat that is generated from a light source that will penetrate and heat up objects. And that's what's happening here with the Behmor. This is older technology, but it still does a great job. So it has a drum. It does not have a fan that you're going to change the fan speed. There is a fan inside that does kick on as you're part of the way through the roast to help the convective style roasting take place. So you do get some air movement, but it's not something you control. You can control the drum speed. You can control the amount of power, the amount of heat that you're generating manually. This roaster also has a chaff collector so that it does not make a big mess. But if you are trying to cool the coffee quick, then you're going to open the door up and chaff will blow all over the place. As far as smoke, for all of these, as I mentioned, all roasters are going to smoke, but this roaster does have a smoke suppression system built into it, and it does seem to reduce the amount of smoke unless you open the door, and then you're going to have a lot of that smoke come out. So you need good ventilation. Also, you're going to need, as I mentioned, a vacuum to help clean up. And then you are able to roast profiles with the Behmor. Each roaster has advantages and disadvantages, and you'll hear me talk about that in the videos that I do for each of these roasters that I've used. It doesn't mean that they're no good. It just means that you need to figure out ways around their weaknesses to be able to accomplish your goal, whatever your profile goal is for that coffee. All right, and now we move on from the Behmor and we go to the Kaleido. Now there are, as I mentioned, other drum roasters out there. There's the Kaleido that's out there. There's several other roasters that are out there, and I am not trying to exclude them, but I just haven't had personal use with them, and I'm just sharing with you some of my experiences here. But do your research and think, at least in the beginning, think in these categories that I'm sharing. So budget, right? So this roaster here is $1,800. This is a 2 carbon fiber heating elements. It's a very powerful roaster, 400 gram roasting capacity. This is an expensive roaster, but when you compare it to other 400, 500 gram roasters on the market, this is really a good value. It is fully controllable, air, drum speed, temperature. You have total control over the fan. It does connect to Artisan, so you can use a roasting graph like the professionals and roast profiles with Artisan logging software. And it does have a chaff collector, so that as you're roasting, all the chaff is collected in a box on the side of the roaster. And this is an awesome roaster. This Kaleido M2 is a really cool roaster. You can get larger versions of this roaster and spend up to another extra $1,000. You could spend basically $3,000 for a 1 kilo roaster made by Kaleido, and it's going to have all of the same features. It's just going to be more powerful and be able to roast more coffee. So 400 grams, $1,800, but this takes you into a different realm of roasting than some of the smaller capacity roasters. Doesn't mean that these aren't good. It just is a different type of roasting, and you're getting into larger capacities. And the sky's the limit when it comes to profiling. So you don't have to roast 400 grams. You can roast less than that on this machine and the other machines. And you can roast some really interesting profiles, from a super light roast to a really dark roast coffee. The machine does have a built-in cooling tray. Cooling is a factor, that is a feature. We really didn't talk about how to cool the beans. Most of these roasters, you're going to be dumping the beans out of the roaster and trying to cool them a quicker way, using a quicker method. And there are some inexpensive methods to be able to do that, where you literally will have a colander with a fan, or you can buy a cooling tray on Amazon for around $100, and it would operate kind of similar to something like this, where a fan is pulling air down through the beans, and that will help cool your coffee as well. The Aillio Bullet is really one of the flagship roasters for home coffee roasters that are roasting larger capacities, 800, 600, 800, 1,000 grams, or like a 1 kilo roaster. The Aillio Bullet is a roaster that many roaster people, home roasters, are using, that are planning on maybe either using it as a sample roaster when they move into the professional side of coffee roasting, or they just want something with larger capacity, similar to the Kaleido. But the Aillio Bullet uses its own proprietary software. It has a whole network of home coffee roasters that are sharing profiles together. And that is interesting. That's a whole topic in itself. It is a really great feature to be able to have a community that has the same roasters. For the R1, that costs about $3,500. There's a newer version that's a little more powerful and has some newer features, and that is going to be about $4,000 for that roaster. They're very good quality. It's a great roaster. Many people have used it and have been very happy with it. And again, it has all of the features that you might find in a coffee roaster, controlling air, drum speed, heat. It cools the coffee with a cooling tray, and it has a chaff collector. And it connects to a logging software system. All right, well, I've given you a really brief overview of these roasters, and you need to be thinking about your budget and all of the other features that I mentioned here, including capacity, including what type of control you have over the roaster, and whether it has any sort of chaff collecting system, because the mess is a factor when roasting at home, as well as really, what can you do as far as profiling goes, and are there automated features? And by the way, the Kaleido here has an auto feature to basically follow a roasting profile that it already has done, and the Bullet can do the same thing. The Behmor does have a auto feature, but it's not a smart roaster. It's not following a profile of a coffee you've already roasted. It's basically a pre-programmed profile, kind of similar to the Roma Pro that we talked about. I would love to hear your thoughts and the questions you may have about what I've shared. I'll have links in the descriptions to each of the roasters. I would encourage you to check all that out. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time. Take care.